Sometime in the fire, sometime in the fire, sweet Jesus, He carried me. Sometime in the fire.
You know, we'd go to Woolworths and get paper and pen, whatever, school supplies, and they had a place you could go get hot dogs, but you couldn't sit down. You'd have to get them and go out, and you just ate them standing up on the street or wherever, but you couldn't sit down in there. And that always, you know, it bothered me. There were white and colored water fountains. There weren't bathrooms in a lot of the stores for our black folk to go in, and if there were, it would be listed colored. I remember my father worked at the train station, which is now the depot, and there were separate waiting rooms, white and colored. They didn't call it black then, colored waiting rooms, separate bathrooms, and of course the waiting room for the black folk was smaller and not as attractive as the one for whites. So that's the world I grew up in. Walked into Woolworths and, you know, you did your little shopping, whatever that was. And if you were hungry, there's this long counter with these little chairs all along. And at the end was a place where people could come and order to go. That's where what you had to do. If you were black, you had to order to go. And you just went up and you ordered your whatever. Well, I remember hot dogs because that's what most people would get. And you got them and took your little bag and left. I remember going in there after we could sit down. And just so I could just experience that. And have a grilled cheese sandwich or something.
When the sit-in movement broke, and I mentioned it to Dr. Gibbs, he didn't seem to be surprised as I've reflected on it over the years. I was serving at that point as Dr. Gibbs' administrative assistant. My office was in the Dudley building, right out near the president's office. The first real warning, the first word that I got as such was the day it broke. It happened. It was caught completely off guard. Somebody called, I don't remember who it was, and I called President Gibbs, who was acting. See, Mr. Buford had passed and he'd been named acting president. I called him to tell him that I had just been informed that 4 of our students had gone down to Woolworths and was sitting in at the lunch counter. And there was a pretty long pause. And finally, Dr. Gibbs said, "Well, I hope they get served," and hung up the telephone.
My roommate, Donald Lyons, who's from Washington, D.C., had heard about the incident. And I'm not sure where he heard it, because there was very little TV at the time. And he suggested that we would go down the next day. And so we did. And there's a picture of him sitting at the lunch counter. So we went down. We went down that second day, and we continued to go back. I didn't have any student leadership roles on campus, but we became part of the Student Executive Committee for Justice, which was kind of the umbrella organization that oversaw the directions of the movement after they sat down. And a couple of days later, the Crest store was added. So we split our time between Crest and Woolworth. And by the way, Donald Lyons would be one of the plaintiffs in George Simpkins' suit against the hospitals in Greensboro, which became a landmark decision by the Supreme Court, which opened up hospitals to practices for black physicians across the country. That first week is kind of the big thing because things escalated By that Saturday, you're talking almost 1,000 people from Bernetiae A&T who marched downtown to both stores. And we were inside of both Crest and Woolworth. Crest was the first store to close. The A&T football team had won the conference championship, and they had just received their blue and gold jackets. And so Crest was in the basement, and that's where I was sitting. And there was some heckling coming from some of the whites in the crowd, some of the young whites in the crowd. But then all of a sudden there was this hush, silence. And when we looked at the top of the steps, there were the football team standing, two abreast. I never forget that, because there they were at the top of the steps, just standing there. And then as they began to descend. And the manager jumped up and said, "This store is closed." So we all filed out, went up to Woolworth, and went into the side door and into the store. There was some jostling. There's a clip of me being pushed by somebody. And shortly after that, the manager announced that a bomb threat had been called in and the store was closed. So we left. And we all marched back to A&T. But as we passed the King Cotton Hotel, people threw liquids and debris out the window as we passed by, going back to campus. Right there where the News and Record is, the entrance was the corner of Market and Davis Street. They tore it down. So at that point, that was when we called the moratorium. And so there wasn't any more demonstrations until April 1st. They wanted a chance to talk, and they didn't do anything. So on April 1st, we resumed the demonstrations. The lunch counter was closed. We began to picket. People being transported downtown or walking downtown to participate in the pickets. April the 21st, we came back to the depot, sat down, had a meeting, and made a decision that we were going to go into the restaurants and sit at the lunch counters, even though they were closed. And so we were asked to leave, and we didn't. The police came. They came with their paddy wagon, the Black Mariah, as they call it. And so the 45 students who were arrested, we were carried downtown to the police station, and we were booked mug shots. We were fingerprinted. We were detained several hours, a couple hours. Mrs. Goldie Hargett, who owned a Hargett Funeral Home, and Dr. B.W. Barnes, who was a dentist, came down and bailed us out. Together, they bailed out all 45. 13 students from Bennett. And a lot of people make this a big ado about UNCG participation. Well, there wasn't any UNCG participation except for one day. The chancellor chastised them and called a student body meeting and said not to go back down there, so they didn't come back anymore. Women's College became UNCG. At that time, it was Women's College, WC. Women would go there 2 years, and then after that, they could transfer to Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill didn't have freshmen and sophomore women. The two white women you see constantly are actually Bennett students, Mary Bender and Jean Neff. And they came on the third day when the Bennett students came, they came. And they were there continuously throughout the demonstrations, and they were arrested in that 45 on April the 21st.
Bennett was an integral part of the civil rights movement. And if they don't get their due credit, or just credit, but they were an integral part of planning, they were an integral part of marching and all of the whole 9 yards.
From the point of their sitting down, the actual demonstrations and the planning was left to the Student Executive Committee for Justice. They went around and made speeches and talked nationally on television and stuff. But the day-to-day operations they were not really in charge of those things. In 1960, only 45 people got arrested. Only 2 of them got arrested with the 45. That was Joe McNeil and Ezel Jabril. Frank McLean was not one of them, and David was not one of them. The Student Executive Committee for Justice, the co-chairs were the president of the SGA at Bennett, Gloria Brown, and the other person was Edward Pitt from A&T. He was a student leader, but he also was a sports editor for the Register. But he was the co-chair along with Gloria Brown. And so they conducted the meetings. So it was a joint effort between Bennett and A&T. The meetings took place usually on A&T's campus, on Bennett's campus. We met in Graham Hall, a couple of houses there on campus where the newspaper office was. A couple of those houses are still there. We may have met in the house that eventually became the African Heritage Center. We met in the gym or the auditorium, because there were times when we had mass meetings, student body meetings, and Dr. Gibbs was good about not trying to cut things off. The 60 demonstrations desegregated 4 facilities. Everything else in Greensboro is still segregated. That was Crest, Woolworth, Myers Tea Room, and I think a Walgreens drugstore. There are three different events, but people have now kind of they all kind of meld together, That was the sit-ins of 1960. That was the movie theater demonstrations of 1961. And then there was the mass demonstrations of 62, 63, where you had thousands of people being arrested. In fact, we had more people arrested in Greensboro than any place else in the South. People know about Birmingham and Montgomery because of the fire hoses and the dogs and that kind of thing, the bombing of the church in Birmingham. But in terms of volume, numbers of people in the street, people in arrested, Greensboro did that.
I heard that in 1936, the football team protested and had march around the Carolina Theater downtown because they had wooden seats up there in the balcony and didn't have cushion seats. So they closed the theater down for a couple of weeks and reopened it with cushion seats upstairs. So the students on A&T's campus have the reputation of being thought of outspoken.
Student body itself was not always on the same page with administration in terms of their attitude about social change. I can recall as a student when Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown was brought up on the campus during President Luthor's administration to give us a lecture on how we should behave in the segregated society, because there had been some rumblings and some threatening during that period when students wanted to go down and try to integrate the theater downtown, but they managed to put a cap on that, and it didn't occur. The incidents, I guess you'd call it, that developed during my freshman year grew out of conditions in the dining hall. This was in 1936, in the fall of 36, when I first came to the campus.
Of course, it was more than just the food, but it was they thought that they didn't have enough social time on Friday and Saturday evening, but the food became the rallying point, and they had a little strike on campus, which a number of my classmates got letters that summer not to return.
They stopped going to class and demonstrated, marched around campus. There's quite a bit of damage done to the dining hall. The names of 2 come to mind. Both of them are now deceased. One was a young man whose name was Parker, Sam Parker, I believe, who was from Delaware. He was quite vocal. There was another fellow from one of the eastern North Carolina counties, and his name was Belcher. And then there was a homegrown leader, J. Kurt Gill. He was a Greensboro native. He did not live on the campus. He was an older student but who was interested in the cause. So those were three of the major ones that I recall who were quite vocal and who were giving the speeches and when they'd have their mass meetings and managed to keep the students fired up and keep them demonstrating until they could get the attention of the administration. It took several days and several meetings with the Board of Trustees along with the central administration to get things settled down. Before that, you had the table, family arrangement. And if you happen to have had a good group of people at your table, everybody got served. But if you wound up at a table where you had some who were not well-mannered, some people didn't fare too well. After the strike in 1937, they got rid of the family system and put in a cafeteria arrangement. The state found money in a hurry and converted that place and hired a new staff of cooks and a new dietitian, and things were looking up. And I remember this was one of the few times that I saw the president of the trustee board. He was Professor M.C.S. Noble, for whom Noble Hall is named. He came up. He was a professor at Chapel Hill, professor of education, I believe. And all of the trustees in 36 were white. Black trustees were not added to the board until long after I had graduated.
During the 1954 decision by the Supreme Court, of course, school integration became a national fact and a national issue at the same time. Here at A&T, it was a question in North Carolina and a lot of other southern states, what the hell are we going to do now? So they put on a major building program for A&T, the library and other things came here at that time. And the governor came up to foster his program on voluntary segregation. He came with his motorcycle outriders and he came with his Cadillac, 2 Cadillacs and so forth. We had gone to President Bluefoot and said to him, look, what about the students here? What are they thinking and how? The governor coming here, what about? Oh, he just told them, don't worry, that's all under control.
When I was a student, 2 years earlier, he spoke on campus on Founders Day, and he made a very remarkable speech. Everybody was so impressed with the liberal stance that he took, and so at that particular time he was lieutenant governor. He had spent some time in India with Gandhi and whatnot, and he was so impressed with Gandhi and this type of thing. Later he became governor. I understand that he asked to speak here on Founders Day again.
When the announcement was made, Hodgin would be the speaker. President Bluefoot, I think, had already invited him. Hodgin was governor, and so he couldn't uninvite him. Some people, Hodgin was, in some ways, he was a very progressive governor, but in others, he still had his southern roots. And when it came to the matter of race relations, he wasn't very progressive individual in his thinking or in his behavior. So some of Mr. Bluefoot's close advisors felt that it was a mistake, to bring him, because they could sense the tension that was rising as a result of the Supreme Court decision desegregating public education. Things were very tense all over the South at that time. So the decision, I think, was made that somebody would write a speech, more or less giving one or two outstanding contributions that A&T people had made to the state, and send that to the governor and ask him, to speak from that. Kind of stay with that. And thought maybe he could stay out of trouble, and we'd stay out of trouble. Well, that went along fine, because he stayed with the script, sitting there listening to it in Harrison Auditorium.
And he delivered that part of the speech, which was an outstanding speech, and he got applause.
As a politician, he had to touch on this desegregation situation, so he got off a point, so to speak.
He stepped back from behind the podium and stuck his hand in his pocket
and began to put his plug in for the separation of the races, and the pronunciation of the word Negro at that time was in bold. But he didn't use Negro, he kind of slurred it, as most Southern whites did. So he said Negro. And he just kept, said it several times, and that is what caused the ripple.
Every once in a while it was Negress, and the kids would clear their throat. And by the third time they were stomping their feet. And he took off from the podium off of the stage like a track star.
And it wasn't a real noticeable thing. I mean, the student body didn't boo or yell or come out with catcalls or anything. There was some shuffling of their feet and clearing. A lot of folks were clearing their throats in unison. But it irritated him. He turned red and he looked at President Bluford and said, "Shall I continue?" And the president put the ball back in his lap and said, "As usual." I couldn't hear the conversation, but it seemed as though he was saying, "Well, as you wish," or whatever. So he said one or two more words and stormed out of the auditorium. And went out the side door and climbed in his limousine, and he and the highway patrolman took off. And of course, the press was at Covenant, so they blew it all up, made a big deal out of it. Any other time, I don't know that it would have caused very much of a ripple, but the tenseness of the times and the fact that the press got stirring in it caused it to get blown out of proportion, because the students weren't all that insulting. But they did let him know in uncertain terms that they didn't appreciate the way he was pronouncing. They felt he should have said Negro or black or colored or something. He could have used colored and probably gotten by all right. But he kept saying Negro. And Dr. Bluford was visibly shaken, by it, as I recall. There was no demonstration, no marching, anything like that. We just went on and closed out the program.
So they had in the newspaper that the students of A&T booed the governor. I was right there. I saw it, heard it. And shortly after, in support, who could see what was going on? Yeah, because I was right in the middle of the, we all just came in the auditorium. Who could tell who was shuffling their feet?
The surprising thing, though, that were some of the newspapers in North Carolina, some of them criticized the students, but some of them supported the students.
The Sunday following the incident, President Bluford called a faculty meeting, and there was a lot of hand-wringing. The discussion centered around whether to write a letter of apology to the governor or what to do. And the decision was made to write this letter apologizing. So Dean Gibbs was authorized to write the letter for the faculty and the staff and the students apologizing for the conduct of the students. And that was sent to the governor. And that was as a result of that Sunday. The governor acknowledged the letter of apology with about 2 lines. "I hereby acknowledge receipt of your letter of apology." Period. That was it. But that, unfortunately, I don't know whether it had anything to do with President Bluford's illness. I don't think he was well to start with, but that Sunday was the last time we ever saw him publicly again. He went in and he had this heart attack. He never did. He passed. He lingered for a while and passed.
Dr. Wuffel got sick after that.
Went to the hospital.
And went to the hospital. And they said, the students said he died of an overdose of desegregation.
Administrators at that time, the black administrators had a lot of pressure.
Right.
And they were under stress.
Under a lot of stress.
See, and they had to be shrewd politicians. Politicians to try to work for both sides. Try to work
keep
with
their
the
jobs.
whites to get support. They had to get financial support. See, they didn't have black legislators then. They didn't have black people in position to, put money in the budget. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So therefore, they have to try to work in a way to get that financial support and work in a way to really protect, the black citizens, black students and faculty and staff.
I don't know if it's just me. This sounds a little familiar. The Saturday issue of the North Carolina Times, posted November 12, 1955, talks about Governor Hodges. Here's what it says. Those of us who remember the Honorary R. Greg Cherry, former governor of North Carolina, whose battlefield courage won him the title the Iron Major, recall that he once admitted to getting part of his education at what was formerly the North Carolina College for Negroes. Mr. Cherry had been invited to speak to North Carolina college students in the fall before his election. Cherry was the 61st governor of the state of North Carolina. His time in office lasted from 1945 to 1949. He spoke with A&T prior to 1945, which was right before he went into office. Dr. J. E. Shepard, with that unerring sense of political prophecy, which won him the respect of friend and foe alike, introduced him as the next governor of the great state of North Carolina. Mr. Cherry arose to speak, and he discussed in some detail the progress of education in the state. He referred particularly to progress among the state's Negro citizens. He had difficulty pronouncing the word Negro, and his pronunciation ended up with something that rhymes with trigger. Students shuffled their feet. The governor realized that something was displeasing his audience. After the speech, he was approached by two Negroes who knew him and respected him as a man. They explained that the speaker's pronunciation had unintentionally offended. After he became governor, Mr. Cherry returned to Duke Auditorium, substituting the word colored for the word Negro in his references to educational progress among Negroes. In effect, the governor said he was unaware that his pronunciation varied from acceptable usage. He assured all that no offense was intended and expressed appreciation to the friends who informed him of that part of his speech which was displeasing to his audience. It has been said that comparisons are odious, and in the case of the Iron Major and the voluntary segregation Hodges, nothing could be truer. Now, I don't know if it's just me, but this seems a little similar to the incident that happened in November of 1955. I think we have a case of deja vu here.
There are two cities. One that was Greensboro, North Carolina, from my North Carolina history, because we studied it in the 8th grade. And then there was another city called A&T that I knew because whenever we were going to the basketball championships, we went to A&T. Or if we were going to the East-West football games, we went to A&T. Or if you were going to the band clinic, you went to A&T. Well, I remember reading about in Greensboro that these two black men, George Simpkins and Charles Herbin, won a tennis championship. This was 1955, the city championship. And, but then I also knew that at A&T, the students had booed the governor. I was on my way to A&T, but my ticket said Greensboro, North Carolina. And so I got to Greensboro, And true enough, A&T was in Greensboro, but not of Greensboro, because it was this isolated, segregated place away from the main stream of things. And it was a self-sustaining operation. Everything that we needed was there on the campus. So, A&T was a different place. We were in Greensboro, but we weren't of Greensboro.
When I was ready to go to high school in 1928, there was no high school in Rutherford County for Black people. There was a beautiful high school built in the 20s for whites, but nothing at all as far as a high school for Black people. But my energetic mother and father sent me to Asheville to a private school. We worked our way. It's called Allen. It was Allen Home then. It's disappeared now. But there were hundreds of us, all girls. American Missionary Society, related, of course, to the Methodist Church, who went to school. The school was started in the late 1890s and closed in the 70s, after integration. But when I graduated as a high school graduate, even though I was just 17, I was offered a job and I took a job as a teacher. I was too young to teach and I am angry about it now. But that's all the children have, because there were a few Black teachers who hadn't even finished high school. But we managed pretty well. The students behaved, but we were in a shack on a hilltop with a little wood-burning stove and stuff. And we walked to school while the white kids rode to school on buses. But this Rosenwald school that I went back to teach in, after I left the county in 1939 to graduate, did produce students who went to college and who became outstanding people. The school rotted down after integration. The big lie that said schools were separate and equal. They were separate, but they were not equal.
I finished school in Hamlet. I finished in a Baptist church. Finished school in a Baptist church. We had a school for Black folks earlier, but it had burned down. They never built it. So we went to school in a Baptist church. And we had 4 grades at that time. Didn't have a 12th grade. We had 8, 9, 10, and 11. That was 4 grades of high school. Now the 8th grade was in one corner, the 9th grade was in another corner, the 10th grade was in this corner, the 4th corner was 11th grade. And you had an 8th grade teacher and a 9th grade teacher and a 10th grade teacher. Whatever you learned in the 8th grade, that one teacher taught you. We had some of the best teachers that I think that have ever been in existence, all the way through high school. And every day we would walk about almost 5 miles to school. And I lived on Highway 74, the highway from Shaw to Hamlet. And every morning we'd go to school, the school bus would pass by us, and the white children there would throw things out the window at us. So when we saw the school bus coming, we ran in the woods to keep having things thrown at us.
May I say that changes which are dramatic are the ones that we remember. But often these changes are preceded by small incidents and small and tiny little advances that are unknown. And let me tell you about one that relative to A&T, long before the very famous one of the students sitting in the Woolworth cafeteria. And where I might ask, need your assistance, because before the Brown Act, there was the Supreme Court ruled on the Interstate Transportation Act, I believe it was, in which they had a little clause in there, and I don't think they did this intentionally, but it would only be interpreted that way after they made their ruling, that there must be no discrimination in interstate transport. Now, the Crisis magazine and others pointed out, well, what about blacks who move back and forth both in commerce and in travel? Did that not apply? Students, not only in A&T but elsewhere, took it up and felt that they would test this ruling. And the students formed groups in which they decided that they would board buses, which was a very popular form of transport for black people, that went from this state to other states. And they didn't have any money and any guidance, so they approached teachers, faculty members, who were a little on the activist side to support them. The faculty members at A&T had to be very, very careful because the least knowledge of this on the part of the administration, and obviously they'd be fired, and jobs, of course, are getting. So a number of faculty members would come together secretly and raise funds out of their modest salaries, and students would give what little they could, and then we would train the students. When you go, you must under no circumstances carry a knife, not even a penknife. You must be deferential and polite and not get into any fights, although you're going to be handled very roughly and things of this nature. And students began to do this. The students always, we urged them to travel in twos, and no girl students, just the males. And then a faculty member would be the sponsor of the student and would always be on the phone and would agree to remain at home so that if any trouble occurred, that faculty member could handle it as best he could from Greensboro. One of the students that I remember who I worked with was Reginald Reeves, also a Greensboro young man, and he went out on 2 or 3 of these trips. And generally, the local police were so astounded and so confused that they did make the trip. The southern racists and the majority of Southerners, and certainly the authorities were racist, decided, well, let him go ahead to Virginia, let the people in Virginia handle it, or to South Carolina, or to Washington, rather than to try to handle the situation there. But in one instance, he was handled rather rough. He and his colleague was handled rather roughly in some small town. And he called me, and I think he needed something like a $250 bail, or else the sheriff told him that if he didn't get out of there, the rednecks had heard about this, and they knew that this little trick, as they call it, was going on, and the sheriff was not sure that he could manage him. Reed called me, and I immediately called everyone that I knew who were in on this together, because $250 was an enormous sum. And we dug deep, we got the money, and we sent it to him, and Reed and his friend got out safely. The fact that they quickly got the money, again, shocked the people in this little town, and they felt they were handling something that they couldn't handle, and so there was no further danger to the kids until they got to Greensboro. This type of thing was going on before the major repercussions of the civil rights movement took full form, but they were the little ripples that built into the flood.
Before graduation in '47, I reached the point where I decided on my own that I had ridden on the back of a bus for the last time involuntarily, and that I would not do it anymore. So that spring, with a group of other students, I went down to Charlotte to a game at Johnson C. Smith, and then when I was returning, I was alone, and I still shudder at the thoughts of what I was doing, because I had no backup, no committee, no group, nobody knew what I was doing, and I could just have disappeared. This was at a time long before Rosa Parks. I got on a bus in Charlotte and sat on the front seat, and the driver pretended not to notice, because even then Charlotte was a little bit enlightened. But he waited until we got out of town to a little country town of Cherryville, I think it was, and he stopped the bus and got up and demanded that I move. And I engaged him in conversation, discussed it at length as to why should I have to move when I had paid the same for my ticket that anyone else had paid. And he insisted that I move. I would have to move, and I told him no, I didn't have to move. I was quite comfortable where I was. And then a woman from the back, not a person of color, came up and sat beside me. And that, of course, exacerbated the situation. And he was lunging towards me, reaching towards me, and insisting that I move. And she said, if you pull him out, you'll have to pull him out over me. And, of course, she was putting herself at risk, too. But at any rate, the bus driver became redder and redder and more frustrated. And finally, he called the sheriff, who came in blustering with the same ritual. You've got to move, you can't sit in the front, you've got to go in the back. And I went through the same thing with him. And when he kept insisting that I had to move, I said, well, am I under arrest? And he said, no. I said, then I don't have to move, and I will stay here. And this went on for quite some time, and finally, he became so exasperated that he said, yes, you're under arrest. So he took me off the bus and to jail, and my parents had no money to bail me out, and I called John Withers, who was teaching at A&T at the time. He had been lecturing some of his students on activism, and I wasn't in his class, but I knew of him. He also was born and reared in Greensboro, and while we were not close or not even friends at the time, his name came to mind as someone who might be able to help. And John wired the money to get me out of jail before I could be taken out of jail. So I have to credit him with having saved my life. But that was long before the sit-ins and at Woolworth or any of the other civil rights activities in the state. And I hope that it made a contribution to those other later efforts.
Let me just say two or three quick things. In the history of the United States, we've had to rely on different branches of the government at different times to make the kind of changes that need to be made. At one point in our history, the Supreme Court hurt us much more than it helped. You see? And then later on, another part of the government was the problem. And so the question now is, in terms of governmental action, which branch of the government will we get the best results from? And that's a difficult question at this point. But you've got to have, at some time, somebody to enforce the rights of people. And that's where the courts come in and say, this is right. This is in accord with the Constitution of the United States. And it doesn't itself effect the change, but it sets in place something to make the changes that need to occur. So when the United States Supreme Court said that the old doctrine of separate but equal has no place in education, well, first of all, it had no place really in America, in essence, is what it was saying. While it was not self-effectuating, it set the pace and set the country on the right tone, I think. And so then it was left up to, largely, to the executive branch and the legislative branch to continue with that. I disagree with people who say that stating the law doesn't make any difference. It does make a difference. Because once it's said emphatically by the highest court of the land, others tend to get in line with that.
Now let me tell you what happened in all the sit-in cases. Our contention in that was that we didn't contest, they never went to court. I appeared for them, waived their appearance, because we didn't contest the facts We said it's against the law to have the law to discriminate. So the law is unconstitutional. That's where we argued. Didn't have any evidence. We didn't say, yeah, they came down and they stepped down and they blocked the traffic, they set the streets, they did everything you said they did. But they were violating an unconstitutional law. And I had all the people that own property, a few people that own property, they would sign blank bond. They would put on a $10 or $20 bond. And they would sign the bond. I would out the whole bond in my pocket. And when they did the rest, when I'd write your name in and hand them the bond and get them out. They'd let them out.
The other thing that might be said here is that the administration at A&T, when this pressure began to build for civil rights, human rights, the administration here, I think, took a more progressive attitude, at least more of a laissez-faire. Well, it really wasn't laissez-faire because to some extent he was encouraged on a quiet pay basis.
Dr. Gibbs was a veteran of World War I. He was a Harvard graduate in business and economics. He came to A&T and became, quote unquote, the dean, because he was always respected more or less as the dean of A&T, even though there were deans of other departments. He seemed to have garnered that particular title.
I have a great deal of respect for Dean Walter T. Gibbs. People tried to discourage him, but they didn't know Dean Gibbs. Dean Gibbs, who had attended Harvard and so forth, didn't back down for anybody. Well, there were a great many politicians who called up and tried to throw their weight around and saying, why don't you do something about these students? And he said, we don't teach them what to think, but how to think. In other words, he said, they can make up their own minds, and nobody at A&T is going to try to stop them from what they're doing.
The things that he said, he was not intimidated or pressured by the city or state officials who tried to get him to control the students. He made sure that his staff and the dean of men and people were very protective of us, and our rights. The things that we appreciated from Dr. Gibbs was that at other schools, students were expelled. And he later told me that he had conversations with people at Southern and other places about that, about kicking students out. In fact, one of the students, a fellow by the name of Guy, ended up enrolled in the A&T after he was expelled from Southern. But no, he, where other people were clamping down on students and expelling them and threatening them, he didn't do any of that. And part of why we were able to do what we were able to do was because we had an administration who was not opposed to our demonstrating.
He was very vocal about the demonstrations. He was approached about what could be done, along with Dr. Dowdy. He was approached about what could be done to end the sit-ins and this sort of thing. And it occurred to him that, no, we don't want to end it. It's a pretty nice thing. And so he gave his efforts to it. He said, well, we don't tell them what to think, we tell them to think. And as a result of their thinking, they are taking these steps within city government. And so he endorsed very strongly the student movements at A&T.
I think Dr. Gibbs was probably under more pressure than Dr. Player, because Bennett is a private Methodist institution and A&T was a state institution. And I think he was under much more pressure than Dr. Player. And I commend him for just not shutting everything down and really stopping the students, if you know, or attempting to stop the students. I don't know if anybody could have stopped us, but it was a difficult position to be in.
Dr. Gibbs retired in the spring of '60. Proctor came the fall of 1960.
Proctor was brought here with the idea that he was going to cool things off, but it didn't work out quite that way.
The rumor was that he got the job because he was going to cut off demonstrations at A&T. And he sent it to that. And so in '61, when we started to adjust the theaters, we had a difficult time meeting on campus. And so where we had that freedom with Dr. Gibbs to call a meeting, you know, student body or something, we didn't have that freedom with Proctor. So we eventually ended up meeting on Bennett's campus. I remember one evening, we were supposed to have a rally in Holland Bowl. And usually when you had a rally, you know, the ROTC would bring the speakers out, set them up, you know, kind of stuff. We got to the bowl, we didn't have anything. We were told that we could have the meeting in Harrison Auditorium. We got to Harrison Auditorium, it wasn't open. Told that, well, the auditorium at Hodgett Hall. By the time we got through, we were in a classroom building in Hodgett Hall, and all our forces had been dissipated, you know. So that was the last time we met on campus. And contrast that with Dr. Dowdy ascended to the presidency, and the attitude and mood changed again, and we were able to begin to do things.
The sit-ins and the marches and that movement, the transformation was not just a transformation that Greensboro experienced. It was a transformation that this country experienced and the world experienced.
Sometime in the fire, sometime in the fire, sweet Jesus, He carried me. Sometime in the fire.
Got a call from George Simpkins, who was president of the NAACP, said, well, why don't we try to do something? All of the theaters were segregated, except you could go to the Carolina Theater, to the National Theater, but you had to sit up in the balcony. Porgy and Bess was playing at the Cinema Theater on Tate Street. It's now that bookstore. And Pearl Bailey was the star in Porgy and Bess. So there were 4 students, myself, Charles Austin, my roommate Don Lyons, and Robert Pat Patterson, and Bill Thomas. The 5 of us went to the cinema, and we were denied entrance, so we began to picket. And we began to go back. Again, Bennett students and A&T students joined in, other Bennett and A&T students joined in. So we began to picket on a regular basis. The National Theater, the Carolina Theater, and the Center Theater downtown. The Center Theater is where the End Club is. The blacks couldn't go in there at all, either that or the cinema, but you know, you could go to the National and to the Carolina. And by the way, we were joined by the Klan out there. And that's what I was telling we had this struggle with at A&T about meeting places, so we moved our activities to Bennett. And that continued until school was out, and things just kind of dropped. So things didn't pick up again until the spring of 1962 when CORE started the Freedom Highway Project. Well, by that time, Dr. Proctor was gone. Dr. Dowdy was now the acting president of campus. CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, which had sponsored Freedom Rides, was doing what they call their Freedom Highway Project. They were challenging Howard Johnson's and hot shops along the eastern seaboard. Okay. There was a hot shop in Greensboro on Summit Avenue, where Libby Hill is now. That was a hot shop. And the hot shop was a lot like Shoney's. And there were also demonstrations at Howard Johnson's. There was a demonstration in Chapel Hill on 501 at the Howard Johnson. And so we carried a busload of people from Greensboro now to participate in that demonstration. It was a Sunday afternoon. So after we got back that week, we decided to organize a Greensboro chapter of CORE. And Bill Thomas was elected the chairman. I was elected the first vice chairman. And Robert Pat Patterson was the second vice chairman. And so we began that summer to meet on a regular basis. The meeting place was in the basement of Providence Baptist Church. And a number of the women at Bennett had been students at Dudley who were participating in the 1960 demonstration, but they were now at Bennett. So they helped form the nucleus of the CORE chapter. And so they brought other Bennett women in, and then other people from the ENT. The coordinating committee consisted of the NAACP, CORE, Greensboro Citizens Association, and the Ministerial Alliance, which is now the pulpit for it. And so the coordinating committee at various times would put on large meetings. The Ministerial Alliance their responsibility was to find locations, like churches where they had mass meetings could be held. It would depend on what the event was. The plan of the demonstration was left to CORE. And then NAACP, of course, did the legal kind of, the money and the legal kind of thing. During that period of time, we would have big meetings like at Trinity. We had meetings at St. Stephen's, the old St. Stephen's Church. It's on Gall Street, next to Washington School. And you had to go up some steps to get into that. But then our weekly meetings were held in the basement of Providence. And they were open to the general public, so people could come in and participate. The office, though, was at the Church of the Redeemer, and that was where we held our administrative office. We did our newsletter and received our phone calls and things. Actually, 24 hours a day, in that facility. That somebody was at around the clock. Father Hicks was the chair of the coordinating committee during that period. He eventually was replaced by Dr. Pendergrass from the chemistry department at ENT as the chair of that committee. We had these mass arrests, and the women, the students were carried down to the polio hospital, and there weren't any facilities. Women like Mrs. Feaster, Minnie Feaster, they would come over to the Redeemer and prepare sandwiches and food, and the community fed the students who were incarcerated. We collected toiletries and things and carried them down there. Dr. Blair, I remember one day she had, right after the first mass arrest, she had gone down to visit the young ladies, and she came by the church. People were in the kitchen preparing food, so she sat there in the chair with her tailor blue suit and a little pillbox hat, talking about, I had just finished visiting the ladies. Dr.
Claire, though she supported us, her first obligation was to see that we were educated. However, when several of the Bennett women were arrested in the marches and so forth, she got up in chapel and said if she had to confer degrees in jail, she would. But she made sure that she sent your homework to wherever you were detained and your personal items. So that sent a wonderful message to many of us who are at Bennett that it's always good when your president, when the leader supports you. And so we got that message loud and clear.
Providence Baptist Church was a focal point
during the civil rights movement, because it was only one block from the campus, and the students would meet there in the evenings and start marching at 6 o'clock in the evening and march downtown and marching and singing, peaceful demonstration. And some of the students even stayed in the church basement, and they slept at night in the church basement.
Dr. Lynch was a pastor, so we had weekly meetings there in the basement of Providence, and on occasion there would be meetings upstairs. Some people say that the church was on Bennett Street, but it was not on Bennett Street. It was in Dean's Alley. That was a whole different street, whole different section up there. The church was taken by redevelopment, the city of Greensboro, in their redevelopment scheme. They relocated the church and it was torn down. So for about 2 years, we had to meet in the A&T's campus in Harrison Auditorium.
There were numerous black businesses along Market Street. Some of them were very thriving businesses. And after the redevelopment of Market Street and the rerouting of Market Street, those businesses were mostly demolished. The buildings were demolished, and the owners of the businesses had to move elsewhere, and many of them did not thrive after that.
The railroad track there goes along Market Street, 3 or 4 blocks from Jefferson Square, but it was on this side of the railroad track. No gardens on east of the railroad track. They got urban renewal, and urban renewal was supposed to destroy all them substandard homes and make sure to put water, utilities and stuff in there, and then sell them back to the folks so they could come back in and build houses and standard houses. What they did in Greensboro, they took all that property down, and then they put that main post office there. And they only 2 things they had was Brown and Harvard's funeral home. The only thing they had was left there. And I was representing all those folks whose houses they were condemning. And I was about the only one here that would take it. Nobody else would take those kind of cases. There wasn't no money in it. You didn't get paid. I didn't get paid a nickel for representing. I represented over 1,700 civil rights cases, and I never got paid 1 nickel. I was the Thurgood Marshall at that time was head of the ACP, Legal Defense Fund, but Legal Defense Fund was one of defending them all. And I was Conrad Pearson in Durham was the chief counsel for North Carolina. I was the assistant counsel for North Carolina. And I had everything from not counting Durham, but from Durham to Ashford. We had everything, and Conrad had everything back east. And when I had to go, sometimes I'd go upstate to Statesville. Statesville was particularly bad. They'd have some sit-in, and they set it for trial, said 9:30 on Monday morning. I'd go up there, be there at 9:30. They let me sit there until 5 o'clock when they continue the case. I'd have to drive all the way back because there was no place to stay nowhere. And I could write Conrad. I said, Conrad, I know we don't have the money to pay for this, but can I get a little help on the expenses, gas expenses? He said, boy, we spent over $500,000 getting you in the University of North Carolina. Says payback time, now going back to work, you never got a penny.
I remember when I was a college student, vaguely, that Market Street kind of started making a turn as it goes behind this building and kind of heads back towards A&T. And that was before the current library that's there now, the new Bluford Library. Before that, it would actually turn back on campus. When they widened it, they straightened the street out, and then they moved all of that stuff that was on each side of the street over, and it caused people to move. The houses that were there are gone. It isolated the properties on both sides of the street. And the commercial districts that were kind of lined up down Market Street, a lot of them no longer exist.
I was an organizer. My concern was getting people. I had relationships with, I had some homeboys. People like my brother Donald and my cousin Herbert but there were other members from Asheville, and we had a network of folk, and so we were able to draw them into, and then I networked with the women at Bennett, and we spent a lot of time knocking on doors, moving through the community, talking to people, forming coalitions with people. So that's kind of how we got people to come. I worked with high school students from Dudley and from Lincoln Junior High School who were, we had kids from Lincoln who were engaged. We have these sessions in the dormitories where we were constantly pushing the demonstrations and recruiting people to come.
And sometimes speakers would come. Civil rights or activists would come to various churches, and we would all gather, and then afterwards we would talk about the next move, the next march, where it was going to be, when it was going to take place, how we were going to conduct ourselves, who were going to make banners and posters. So it was that kind of thing. I remember Farmer coming to one of the churches, and I remember how electrifying that was. And lots of students there, a lot of organizers there, and he just put the motivation and the fuel that we needed if we didn't have enough, as if we didn't have enough. But I remember being there and just feeling so energized and so committed, and it was like rededicating yourself again to what you were doing.
James Farmer, who was the National Director of CORE, he was the major speaker coming in. Floyd McKissick, who replaced him as the Director of CORE. And then we had Dick Gregory, we had James Baldwin. In NAACP, and we had this fellow named Zarvenkoffer. Farmer's speeches, one was at Trinity, and one was at St. Stephen's, the old St. Stephen's Church.
Vernon Jordan, like people like that. Benny Mays would come to Bennett on many Sundays. I mean, I felt like people were putting their arms around us that were older and wise and just urging us on.
At that time, black lawyers couldn't live in no hotels, nothing. So I really built this house to accommodate them, and they all slept downstairs together. Martin Luther King, Thurgood Marshall, all of them. And I got this complete living quarters down there. We had a dorm waiter coming up to there when my wife would cook and send down food down there to us, and we would do all our work down there, They would sleep down there with benches and cots and everything, because there was no place for them to stay in Greensboro. You had the old Magnolia House, but now that was for entertainers. And so this was the only place they had to sleep. Every time the civil rights person came through, they stayed here in the basement. Separate entrance to the basement down there. I represented all the students at that time. I was the only lawyer who practiced civil rights law at that time in North Carolina.
There was two ways of getting downtown. One was to walk downtown during the time that we were picketing. The other thing was we, in front of Graham Hall on ENT's campus, we had tables and things set up so people could come and sign up, in shifts. And there were there were mostly veterans who had cars and a few off-campus students who had cars. So they would shuttle people back and forth downtown to the picket lines. We
would start, for example, at Bennett College. We would walk up Washington Street all the way downtown. And at that time, Bennett women didn't wear pants. So we'd have our skirts or dresses and so forth on. Many of us had banners. And if I were in a group that was doing the Woolworths, we may have 14 people. And we just kept moving around and around. And we practiced, and people came in to teach us how to do that. If somebody pushed you, you didn't push back. If somebody threw something at you, you didn't throw back. And we'd have 3 or 4 groups doing it. And then you'd get relief in about an hour, hour and a half. Another group of students would come. And then sometimes we would march from A&T down Market Street to downtown. And there would be just hundreds of us marching. And some would split off at one place, some would split off at another, and then some would go on to another place, and then we would come back together and march back.
I never saw actually a uniformed cop. And I'm sure they were there, but I hadn't seen them. And we would go and they would spit and throw at you something, you know. But nobody really got hurt either. And I knew they were protesting just like we were protesting to get in there. They were protesting to keep you up.
61 theater demonstrations and the 62 demonstrations, 62, 63 demonstrations. There were quite a few whites. Dr. Weisner was a refugee from Austria to escape Nazism. There were whites from Guilford and from Greensboro College, and the American Friends Service Committee people, you know, so there were a number of whites who were actually a part of CORE. Richard Ramsey, who was the college secretary for the American Friends Service Committee and worked with various college campuses, he was a real active member of CORE.
I worked with Bill Thomas, and Bill got an award. He's an unsung hero. And Bill and I grew up together and went to school together. I think he was at Dudley at the time, actually. And I may have been a freshman or so at Bennett.
William Thomas, Bill Thomas, who was the Dudley student who took over the demonstrations in 1960 when the A&T and Bennett students left. The Dudley High School students took over the demonstration. Bill Thomas was the leader. Bill Thomas also joined with 4 of us from A&T in 1961 to start the demonstrations at the movie theaters. Okay. And he was also a leader in the youth movement in the NAACP. So he was one of the key people, he and another fellow by the name of Wendell Scott and Evander Gilmer. There's a picture of he and Evander sitting at the counter at the hot shop.
As Bill Thomas has said, Greensboro has got to be made to live up to its reputation as a liberal city. I think the city of Greensboro is deeply involved in this. Our kids need us. He said many of the downtown merchants were ready for integration now, but some few holdouts needed evidence that Negroes would stick together. He described the present unrest as the Second Revolutionary War. He said it is not an anti-white movement. It is as important to them as it is to us because it grants freedom to all citizens.
So going over into the fall of 62, we have all the students back now. So we began to target places like the S&W cafeteria, which was downtown next to the Bells store. That was a Mayfair cafeteria. And other places, because see, the 60 demonstrations only desegregated 4 facilities. Everything else in Greensboro is still segregated. There was Crest, Woolworth, Myers Tea Room, which is in Myers department store, and I think a Walgreens drugstore, which is on South Elm Street. The Guilford Air bars, I think, maybe had opened up. But anyway, other places were still segregated. So in the fall of 62, we began to step up the demonstrations.
James Farmer, National Director of CORE, said, 3 mighty weapons are at the disposal of Negroes in seeking integration. Number 1, our bodies, which we can use for sit-ins, stand-ins, and marches. Number 2, our purchasing power of the dollar. Industry has become conscious of the Negro market. And number 3, the weapon of the ballot. The Negro vote is terribly important to politicians in the South. We can use our bodies, bucks, and ballots to create a democracy with the same rights and privileges for all.
Thanksgiving Day of 62. A number of us got arrested from Bennett and A&T at the Mayfair cafeteria and the S&W cafeteria, which was on Market Street. Mayfair was on North Elm Street.
The spokesman for members of CORE, John T. Hatchett, a teacher at Bennett College, said that the demonstration yesterday was a decision on the part of individuals who felt it would be nice to have Thanksgiving dinner. On this day of Thanksgiving, We feel there could be no better way to observe it than to have age-old barriers fall. He said the group fully expected to be served.
And they managed to create enough unrest until finally the Boyd Morris, who was the manager of Mayfair, decided to just go ahead and open the doors and let them in. But they did it. They made the decision during the summer and then opened it up in the fall.
Leaders within the community within Greensboro either met here at the YMCA or at numerous churches around the city where they would be allowed to come in and meet and come up with strategies of helping further the civil rights movement. And also it was a place where they would raise funds to bail the students out. And they you can imagine they kind of wanted to do this without everyone knowing where the money came from or who gave them the money, that kind of stuff. So what they would do is they would meet here, discuss that, and figure out where they could get the funds to bail students out of jail.
We had events there, and a lot of times the marches started there. There were other events like James Baldwin and Dick Gregory, fundraising events at ASO. The NAACP held their regular meetings there, so we would meet there.
In the meantime, the town leaders, they were fuming and having meetings and trying to come up with some strategy other than saying to management down there, well, why don't you just go ahead and serve the people and forget it? Their argument was, well, this is private property. The business has a right to determine who they'll serve, what they'll serve, and blah, blah, blah. So that drug on.
There was a time there was so much unrest around, especially among the students. There was some violence to a certain degree. So that the mayor and the council had a hard time trying to control the unrest. So they decided to appoint what he called his special committee on human relations.
Yesterday's agreement by Greensboro's 4 indoor theaters to desegregate was hailed as a major accomplishment by the chairman of the mayor's special committee on human relations. Dr. G.H. Evans, Negro physician, said that another meeting is planned with the theater managers and the committee members to work out a few of the ifs. For the present, he could not discuss those ifs. But you can say that we are most encouraged after our meeting. Insofar as the cafeterias are concerned, things have not materialized up to this point, but we have a subcommittee working on that phase.
I was president of the Gate City Alumni Chapter at that time. And we met with Dr. Dowdy. You see, it won't be in the packet being put on there on the current now. So Dr. Blunt, myself, and some others of the executive committee of the Greensboro Alumni Chapter. We had a meeting with Dr. Dowdy and formulated a resolution, and the resolution was sent to the mayor, to the city council. Mayor Chink was at that time.
That's right. I couldn't think of his name.
We put pressure on the city government, and Dowdy, protecting the president. And when we start doing that, then they start crumbling, yielding, and getting softer because they knew that these administrators had support.
The police department might not be able to protect these students if they persisted in violating the law. But the city manager told the 2 college leaders after the meeting was over, says, we're going to protect them. You don't worry about that, because he couldn't say that in the meeting, but he did assure the president and President Player and Dr. Dowdy that students would be protected. Of course, the movement continued, it grew, spread to other campuses. The movement itself did not interrupt the routine on campus. It was very well organized, as I remember, well coordinated. The students went to classes, and then after their classes, they would arrange to go down And they would go down in the evenings and demonstrate, in front of the building. So it was created quite an uproar.
But we would do them in shifts. If I had classes in the morning and had some time in the afternoon, that's when I marched. Or, there were another group of people. And we coordinated all that with the A&T students and so forth.
And it upset a lot of other business people because the net result was that folk who were, I won't say they were afraid to go downtown, but they stopped going. So it cut back on number of class, because you see that this was before the advent of our major shopping centers. Downtown was the shopping center at that point in time. And the manager of Woolworth said that he was trying to carry out what he thought was the policy of the company. But when they began to lose money and pressure was being applied on them to do something, they just let him hang out there on his own and didn't support him.
But 163, things began to escalate, and we began to expand our targets. It was all in the movie theaters downtown, S&W, Mayfair, places like Biff Burgers, which was another drive-in, like Burger King, McDonald's, which was the only McDonald's in Greensboro on Summit Avenue. They didn't have inside seating facilities, but they had concrete benches on the outside, but blacks couldn't sit at those concrete benches. That was an all-white neighborhood. So if you came through Summit Shopping Center, that was all white. We had gone over to Pickett. That was myself, maybe 3 other guys who had experience being on the picket line, but the rest of the people were, maybe 7 or 8 of us who were kind of new to the thing. And we had finished demonstrating and we were walking back. That night there was a bunch of white guys there who were counter demonstrators. We had to walk back to campus, so as we crossed over there to Summit Avenue, and one of the people, William Lewis, was suspecting something. He went into the drugstore there and made a phone call to Dick Ramsey, who was with the American Friends Service Committee, but Dick had a blue Volkswagen bus. And so the rest of us were walking. We turned on to Sullivan Street, a place called McClure's. It was a steakhouse. We had just turned that corner and was heading down Sullivan Street. And this group of guys were closing in on us. There was a white person in a car who tried to put his car between us and the guys, the group. And some of our people were kind of laying back. So I had gone back to the end of the line to try to get them to move up. And when I did that, this huge guy hit me in the back of the head, and I had a mild concussion from that. And I think the thing that saved me was I didn't hit the ground probably because they probably would have stomped me. But by that time, Dick Ramsey was coming up in the bus, and we were able to get people into the bus, and we had to go back and find Bill Lewis up at the drugstore. We got back on campus. But that night, because Cooper Hall is right there on Laurel Street, whites began to drive through that night throwing, rocks and things at the building, the dormitory.
My sons did participate in the marches, and we were very apprehensive about their welfare, as were all the parents. I witnessed some of the marches. To see these people marching silently and resolutely down the street, knowing that they were risking their lives and their welfare for an ideal, it was overwhelming. It just did something to you that you couldn't explain. And we had a sense or a feeling that history, even then, that history was being made. And we can never thank them enough for the sacrifices, the noble sacrifices that they made.
Important at the time that the students should take a role because there was less penalty for students. There's more of a penalty for faculty because jobs were important in those days, and you could understand why the faculty had some trepidation about moving into and vocally standing out. Some of them did, but they did it differently.
Jesse had transferred in here from University of Illinois to play football.
Jesse, was involved in his fraternity. He was involved in Sunday school with Dr. Sproul at A&T. And so, he was accepted by people on campus, administration, It wasn't until after he got to be involved in the demonstrations that some of those used to want him changed. People say that he was the leader of the SGA. He wasn't. Ezel was the president. Jesse got elected. He was the president in '64, and so that was an attempt to block his candidacy for the presidency. He won anyway. We used to have these discussions, and he was real critical. And he admits it. I said, you put up a shut up. Come on, man, see what we're doing. See what it's all about. And so he did. And I was the one basically who could recruit Jesse. He was a student, and people. And when you started, there's always these questions about his motives and things. And about man, Jesse the preacher. Well, I met Jesse at a religious event. We used to have on campus religious emphasis week. Okay, and there were always some noted theologian coming to town. And on this occasion, Morris Tynes, who graduated from A&T, who was the son of Dr. Tynes at Providence Baptist Church, was the speaker for the week. And so I was at the event. That's where I met Jesse, at that event. And he was always going to Sunday school. He was very active in the Sunday school on campus, But he also was a regular on campus. I mean, you see him out on campus and there'll be a crowd around him, So, and then Jesse would go off and get into books, and everybody else would stand out there still lollygagging, Things continued to escalate. So by early spring of '63, we had thousands of people in the streets, and we would have these silent marches that would start at Hayes Taylor, and people would just walk downtown, back to Hayes Taylor. People were still moving toward downtown. And that continued, but by this time, in late April, Jesse Jackson joined the movement as a participant. Jesse, his oratory ability was able to, stir the crowd and draw people. So he began to march, and a lot of times you see him at the head of the line. There's a picture, I have a picture. He, Dr. Leisner from Bennett and Bank Miller from Bennett leading the line.
Yeah, Jesse was a great speaker, a great orator. And that was his place and his role and his gift and talent to offer to the movement, I think. And I think also Jesse was a good negotiator. And I think that's one of his talents. He was able to talk about it and to motivate people and to get people fired up to do things. And that's what he did. And he's still doing it.
We met at Providence Church. We met there every night. And Jesse would say, now we're going to do march. We're going down there. We're not going to get violent. And he tell you we'd walk down there and people would spit on you, kick at you, throw stuff at you. So we just keep going. Clarence Phillips and I, my wife, too, and his wife, they didn't go as much because they didn't want to allow teachers. I think they told black teachers, we don't want to catch you in there. But they went a couple of times anyway.
Jesse led the march every night. Jesse was quite a leader in that. We would get organized. The places, the groups who were on, and where they would be. We'd come right down to the Market and start up the street. And we'd go all the way to the square, Greensboro Square. Down there where Market and Elm Street. That's the heart of Greensboro. And when we get down there about 1 block before we got to the square, whites would be on both sides. I mean, thousands of them. All the way we had to walk down there. They couldn't stop you. The law would see, the police would see to that. But you had to go down, it'd be so close you could just squeeze. All the way to the Carolina Theater. And then we'd say something. Now, we had some white people who was with us. And then we'd leave there and go back down and disperse. And we had, you can cut this, we had some blacks that looked white. And we had some whites who would walk with these blacks who looked white. And so when the Carolina Theater, they went and bought a ticket. The whole group was out there waiting while this lady's dead now. A lady named Mildred Nash. She was a friend of my wife. But she would walk with this white guy. White man, a man, wasn't even no youngster, he was a man. And they went in the Carolina Theater. Bought the tickets, went on in there. And then, of course, after they were in, they announced that there was a black in the Carolina Theater. And Mildred was the one. And they couldn't find it. They stopped the movie, turn on the lights. Couldn't find that black. I mean, they looked under the seats at everything else, but they couldn't find it. So the group was out there waiting, our marching groups. So finally they came on out and we went on and finished the march. We usually break up at the church at night. But that was an amazing thing. I remember that real well.
Well, the decision makers decided then that we're gonna nip this in the bud. So they started arresting the students, putting them in jail.
Dr. Roy Lee taught at Bennett. My minister, Reverend Bishop, and there was one other man. I can't think of him right now, but when they would arrest blacks for marching or trying to get in a restaurant, they carried them out to the old Coliseum. The Coliseum now is not the one, but they just had one building out there. It's a big fence all around. Now, many times they let them go, and sometimes I don't know how they did it, but we would go out there with Reverend Bishop and Dr. Roy Lee from Bennett, and Clarence and I would go with them out there to help get the people. They'd take them out there and really turn them loose. But sometimes they'd hold you around there, things like, can you make bond or something, But eventually they'd leave, but we'd see that they got back. Everything was okay with them. And we know parents would come up and couldn't find the kids. And we knew that they were out there at the Coliseum somewhere, so we'd help them get them.
The underground movement, it was helping because somebody was putting up money to get these kids out of jail when they would go down. I think it reached a point at that time where if a student hadn't been to jail, he was looked at as kind of suspicious. You either for us or you were against us. I was Dean of Student Affairs at that time. I had Dr. Proctor come. I had taken that job. I was trying to work with Jesse, Bill Gamble, and I, trying to keep the thing from blowing up. So Jesse came by the office one evening and said, "Well, Doc, I think I'm gonna have to go to jail tonight." He hadn't been, and the students were beginning to look suspicious on him. He's out here doing all this speaking and whatnot. So they want to know when he was going to jail. He said, "Doc, looks like I'm gonna have to go tonight." I said, "Jesse, how you gonna help keep things in check. You in jail. He said, well, I don't know. I got to go. Said they put the pressure on me. I said, well, now you you think about that. I said, I need you out here with me. I don't want you. But anyway, he went, spent the night. And I said, now if you decide you want to come out, let me know, and I'll come down there and get you. The kids, there were so many of them, they couldn't put them all in jail, so they had this fence down here near off Market Street there. They built something like a stockade, and they would take them down. The sheriff would take them down there and put them in. It was just a joke. They'd come out as fast as he'd put them in, come up to the campus and take a shower and go back to the stockade. It was quite a deal. And you had, in addition to the A&T students, you had kids from Dudley.
My mom, I think, was so afraid. I don't know why y'all want to go down there and march like that. Somebody's going to hurt you. Somebody's going to do this, hit you or something. And one day we were marching and a knife came right across my foot. It wasn't thrown like this. It was thrown on the ground, thank goodness. And it was kind of scary, people shouting obscene racial names at you and that kind of thing. And you're taught, you can't retaliate. You can't go punch them in their face or whatever. You have to really be focused and you have to keep your eye on the prize, so to speak. For a while, a lot of the adults in Greensboro didn't participate because they were afraid they'd lose their jobs or whatever. But the summer they did that, and they did the sit-in in the street. And my aunt, Lillian Kennedy, was a part of that sit-in. And she was a teacher. I said, oh my goodness. And so many professional black people were out there demonstrating. It was like, okay, that was just the most exciting thing. I knew it would happen.
The latter part of the May decision was made that we needed to do something different. That we were not doing anything to force the mayor to come to the table. So on the 5th of June, where the marchers had always been silent, we decided to sing and clap hands and things. And so when you went downtown, there are more buildings downtown than all these vacant lots. So when the claps were reverberating off the building, that was an awesome sound. And we just didn't go down and turn around. And before, we would always notify this police captain, his name was Jackson, or what our intention. We didn't tell him that night. We just started weaving in and out of downtown. And the police station was on Green Street, right across from the old library on Green Street. And so we got in front of the police station and we ordered everybody to sit down in the street. And Captain Jackson freaked out because usually he had been in control. And he ordered us out. And so we said, Jesse, pray. And Jesse offered a prayer, so that kind of stopped them. So they froze, And so we got up and we started back through Page Tail. The next morning, we would hold meetings at Providence, but the headquarters was the Church of the Redeemer. Our office is set up there. We did all of our, we had a newsletter called The Candlelight that was edited by Dr. Darwin Turner, who was the chairman of the English department. And he had a core of ladies who would distribute it throughout the community, so everybody knew what we were doing. So then that morning, Captain Jackson came looking for Jesse, saying they had a warrant for his arrest for inciting to riot. But Jesse wasn't there, and he was at Mr. Ellis Corbett's house over on Benbow Road. Myself and I think maybe Pat Patterson went by to get him. But in the meantime, people at the Church of the Redeemer called the news media, and we had this impromptu meeting when Jesse got there. And he was talking to the crowd, and the cameras all there. And then we called Captain Jackson and told him that he was at church waiting on him. There are two pictures. One is Jesse walking with Captain Jackson. But there's the first picture is when Jesse comes out the door, he sticks his hands out to Captain Jackson, and you can see Captain Jackson kind of follow it back. So anyway, they carried him off to jail, and so that hit the news. So that night, we had this massive crowd, and that's these pictures of people sitting in the street at the crossroads of Market and Elm Street. That ended segregation in Greensboro that night.
Lewis was right there, Pat Patterson. They worked very, very close to this whole movement. They were some of the leaders. They were some of the unsung heroes. Bundy and Robert Patterson. If we could have made Lewis a Bennett Bell, we would have. He was like a brother to so many of us. They are some real unsung heroes that need to be recognized. Basically, compared to many cities, Greensboro was very civil, for lack of a better term. And the leadership was aware that we needed to be civil. Even when people were arrested and detained in places like the old polio hospital. If you really wanted to leave, you could have just lifted the window and got gone and stepped out of the window, and you would have been gone. And with the singing all night, keeping the guards and the personnel up, there was a level of civility and a level of patience that could not have been. It could have been a very explosive atmosphere, and in most cases it was not. So while I talk about the thirst for equality and justice, I also have to say that I am proud, not proud that we had to do what we had to do, not proud that was the situation in America, but since it was, I am proud that Greensboro did not turn dogs on people, did not turn hoes on people, did not beat people half to death. Well, I knew David Richmond very well. He's from Greensboro, and I knew Ezell Blair very well because both are from Greensboro. I met Joseph and Frank as students at Bennett. Frank married a Bennett Bell.
As a matter of fact, my first encounter with them was with David Richmond, who was in my social studies class at Jonesboro School. And of course, we never envisioned his being a celebrity as he was. The last time I saw him, I was in a supermarket. I didn't recognize him at first, but when he turned around, we hugged each other. And I realized that he had been ill. And that was the last time I saw him. But of course, the other three have continued to appear in public affairs. And I really cherish the connection that I've had with them, or the experiences that I've shared with them.
I think there are a lot of people that should get accolades, and the four of them certainly are. I think there are a lot of people who haven't gotten them that should get them, because they're the unsung heroes that put themselves out there too. But just to know that the movement was successful, just to know that we were a part of changing something where my grandchildren don't even have to worry about whether they can go into Arigatos or whether they can go into K&W. It's just a matter with them is, where do I want to go?
And we'll be go.